HowlSage, Sages of Darkness, Book 1. Written by Brock Eastman. Narrated by J.J. Battiston. Chapter 2. Monday, October 2nd. The warm morning sun glinted against the window pane. The fire was long out. Chairs were not comfortable places to spend the night. Small pops crackled in my neck and shoulders as I stretched. There was no school today due to a teacher in service. I'd have one last critical day to prepare for tomorrow, my first real hunt. I hit the shower. Dressed in a fresh white V-neck and blue jeans, I strolled down the hall toward the elevator. Each of the resident families lived on a different floor, which made it easier to live together. The fifth floor was my dad's and mine until a few weeks ago. Now it was mine alone. My chest tightened with an ache, and I fought it off with a deep breath. Originally, our hotel, the Pink Hippo, had been built in 1848 to house the miners working the nearby coal mines. A wealthy baron had owned all the land surrounding the mines and wouldn't allow houses built within 5 miles. Instead, he had collected rent from the men in the inn. He had charged a ridiculous amount, what some might consider extortion, but paying that was better than making the long trek up the mountain from the sleepy village of Ashley Meadows each day. The inn had shut down in 1860 when the coal mines had dried up. Well, not precisely dried up, I guess. There was still plenty of coal down there. Closing the mining operation was related to my line of work, and the reason for stationing a chapter of the society here in the first place. It was also how the Baron had lost his fortune. Greed gets you, McGarrett had said when he had told me the story. The demons that began flooding through the ether pit fed off the Baron's greed. The Pink Hippo was 15 miles east of Ashley Meadows, deep in Theodore Woods and located at the base of Kinley Peak. It was the eastern United States regional headquarters for the society. The Pink Hippo had 7 floors, a grand lobby, a massive dining hall, a kitchen, 2 libraries, a clock tower, and an indoor-outdoor pool. Several outbuildings also dotted the property, including a stone chapel, horse stable, sheds of varying sizes, and a large workshop, which was a new addition in 1983. The society had commissioned the expansion when the Pink Hippo had become our regional headquarters. It housed our command center, filled with the latest in surveillance technology, as well as the laboratory used to design and build new gadgets and equipment. McGarrett was the commander of our chapter of the Legion der Dämonjäger, or Society, as we called it. I would have said we were an operations team, but the Society preferred the term chapter. McGarrett often joked that he could run a small country from his chair in the command center. Ike thought we had enough technology and weaponry to take over a small country. And he was right. We had everything from powerful explosives to micro-drones and high-speed jetpacks. Ike and I might have had more than one conversation about taking over some small Caribbean island nation and settling there to retire. "Good morning," I said, stepping into the 19th century-style caged elevator. Ike forced a smile. He wore his smart glasses, as I called them. His blonde hair was tousled, and his blue button-up was half tucked into his khakis. I thought about my rudeness from the night before. I coughed. "Hey, I'm sorry, man, about what I said last night. I'll buy you a donut to make up for it." The fake smile turned genuine. Ike's blue eyes brightened behind the square, black-framed spectacles. "No problem. You want to go to the workshop with me?" Ike was like that, instantly forgiving, especially when it came to me. My stomach growled. Breakfast first. "Already ate with my dad at 5. He and McGarrett are checking over the gear again." 5 in the morning was not an option for me, ever. Anything before 7:30 was the middle of the night. "I'll be over as soon as I get a bite to eat." The lift stopped and the metal door clattered open. "See you then," Ike said, hurrying out of the elevator and down the hallway. Mrs. Riley was the only one in the large dining room. She wore a crisp, clean, white apron over a flowery purple dress, with her gray hair in a tight bun. "Good morning, Taylor," she called, flipping several plate-sized pancakes onto a dish. The table was set for one. There was a glass of orange juice, water, and a mug waiting for her hot, spiced, home-squeezed apple cider. I smiled. "Good morning." Mrs. Riley was McGarrett's wife. I had always thought McGarrett was his last name, and Riley was his first name. Still, McGarrett's parents had decided a kid needed both kinds of names. McGarrett Riley. His parents were eccentric or something, or so I had gathered from Mrs. Riley's stories about her husband's family. Mrs. Riley loaded a second plate with a few more homemade specialties: sausage, an omelet, and cranberry apple oatmeal. Everything she made was from scratch. A large greenhouse full of fruits and vegetables, and pens of livestock made sure there was always a ready supply of fresh ingredients, no matter what time of year. Sure, this was a lot of food, but a guy needed to eat. I mean, come on, I was 15 and growing. The workouts and training had ignited an appetite in me like I never knew could exist. Yesterday, Ike had repeatedly called me a ravenous wolf until Mrs. Riley reminded him that a HowlSage embodied physical traits like a wolf. After that, he had simply called me insatiable. I had to ask Mrs. Riley what that word meant after Ike had left. The definition fit. I was always eating. Yet, according to my body mass index, I wasn't gaining extra fat, but muscle weight. All the exercise combined with the protein-loaded meals caused me to bulk up quickly, something I took note of in the mirror every morning. I wore a medium-sized shirt now, and for a 15-year-old, I sported muscles that had the football coach asking me to join the varsity team. But this season, I didn't feel like playing any sports, and I wouldn't have had time for it, even if I had wanted to. "How'd you do last night?" Mrs. Riley asked with a note of concern in her sweet voice. It was no secret I wasn't sleeping well. She must have thought it was still too soon after my father's death for me to hunt. But I was after revenge, and I wanted to be the one to banish the HowlSage and catch the cloak. Good," I lied. "Well, I've been praying without ceasing for you. God is watching over you," she promised. "You're in good hands." I shrugged. Yeah. She wasn't talking about McGarrett and Olson Swigert watching over me. However, in that regard, the two of them were arguably two of the top experts in the society. At least that was what my dad had told me when he revealed who he was and what he did for a job. I'd only learned what my dad did this last April. He waited until my 15th birthday to tell me about his new job. Initially, I'd been okay with his reasoning for waiting. Now I questioned it. I often felt a guilty sense of anger at him. Guilty because he was dead. Angry because he had kept what he did for me for so long. "Well, I'll let you eat. McGarrett is anxious to see you." Mrs. Riley headed for the kitchen humming, "Great is thy faithfulness," as she disappeared through the swinging doors. I dug into the steaming plate of home-cooked goodness. The crisp October air sent a shiver over my bare arms as I stepped out of the pink hippo. The leaves were changing and falling. Hundreds tumbled across the driveway's damp, gray cobblestones in the chilly autumn breeze. The fountain in the center of the circle drive had long been shut off for the soon-to-arrive frost. The sky was dismal and cloudy. I shivered again and pulled my arms across my chest. A lot of people liked the harvest season. I didn't. Give me a hot, sandy beach, some waves, and a freshly waxed board any day. An image of the Australian coast flashed in my mind. It was summer. I was 13, and my girlfriend had a killer accent. She and I sat for hours on the warm sand, watching the waves and sipping cherry colas as the blazing orange sun set in the distance. A gust kicked up a swirl of leaves and swept away my dreamy memory. I shivered for a third time, wishing for the jacket I'd left in my room. But let's be real, I was too lazy to go back for it. Toughen up. One of the workshop's garage doors was open. Blue sparks flew onto the stone driveway. Ike and his dad, Mr. Swigert, were tweaking my gear to perfection. The workshop was where Ike and Mr. Swigert experimented, built, and fixed their inventions, and where McGarrett did research and tracking. Our weapons and vehicles were secured there. It was also the last place I had seen my dad alive, the last moment when I had still thought of him as an invincible, demon-fighting superhero. It turned out he wasn't so invincible. The feeling of loss twisted in me like a screw. My throat constricted. A deep breath and sprint to the garage were futile attempts to bury the thoughts. "Hey, Mr. Riley," I said, entering the command center. "Taylor, my boy. Again, call me McGarrett." He pulled on the end of his gray mustache and shook his head with a smirk. "Right." McGarrett was what his chapter called him when he hunted, instead of using his last name as a team might usually do. I'd always been taught not to call adults by their first name, because it sounded disrespectful. McGarrett turned in his chair, a mug of coffee in one hand. The wall of the command center across from the door was nothing but video displays. The center screen showed a 30-mile radius around Ashley Meadows, encompassing the abandoned coal mines, Coal Chase Lake, 15-Mile Lake, Kinley Peak, Elsie Peak, Waverly Peak, Declan Peak, all of Theodore Woods, and the Bone Fields. Still no sign of our mysterious cloak. McGarrett rubbed a hand through his steel-gray hair. Neither the cameras or sensors have picked up any elevated levels of demon aura at the mines. Maybe they gave up. Maybe there won't be a rising, I offered. McGarrett cleared his throat. Possible. But he doubted it. That I knew. We'll expect the HowlSage to go right into town. It will venture into populated places until it's banished. It feeds off sin like a tick sucks blood from the back of a dog's neck. Thanks for the visual. He chuckled. Yes, well, he pointed to another screen. His words, until it's banished, hung in my mind like a storm cloud. He didn't think I was ready. He didn't believe I was strong enough to defeat it fast enough. Taylor, I've been part of many hunts, as the hunter and as support. McGarrett's green eyes were large, his graying eyebrows arching. I'd heard the coming speech every day since I had become a hunter. It was the speech where he emphasized the importance of the sword, and how the fight was as much spiritual as it was physical. McGarrett cared about me. He felt responsible for me now that both my parents were gone. But I couldn't take any more speeches. I'd begged McGarrett and Mr. Swigert to let me search the tunnels and find the new den, but they wouldn't let me. They had said it was too dangerous, as if fighting a hairy wolf-like beast with razor fangs wasn't terrible. I'd instead get it in its nest then, after it had risen with an appetite. McGarrett clicked his tongue. Taylor, are you listening? This is important. Why do you think I keep mentioning it? Thankfully, our conversation was interrupted by Mr. Swigert, who entered, Ike in tow. Mr. Swigert wore a white lab coat over the top of a thermal shirt that matched his light blue eyes. His coal-black hair was slicked back and parted to the right. He wore these squared silver wire frames that weren't ordinary glasses. I snuck a peek through them once, and the lenses were enhanced screens, providing real-time data. If he was working on an engine, the glasses came alive with labels for each part. Mr. Swigert could even order a part from a society supply depot simply by winking or pointing at the part. Once, though, a case of hood ornaments had arrived since apparently something had gotten into Mr. Swigert's eye, and he'd blinked a dozen times while looking at the hood of McGarrett's car. He had updated the ordering application to require the word confirm to be said to finish placing the order. The J-Pack is ready, Mr. Swigert said. McGarrett raised a gray eyebrow. I guess it's time to train. Mr. Swigert was a well-known inventor in the society. He'd come up with a wide range of weapons, gear, applications, and chemical agents, along with his glasses. He and his wife had chosen Ashley Meadows as their home, and first field tested most of his work there. That had been a lot of what my dad had done between missions. They'd been here for at least 15 years. Ike glanced at his dad. He'd known about the family business since probably birth. Taylor, you ready to fly? McGarrett asked. I shook my head and perked up. Of course. I've also finished a neutralizing agent created specifically for the HowlSage, Mr. Swigert said. But we'll have to wait to test that when you face the demon. The J-Pack sat on a table in the laboratory portion of the workshop. Mr. Swigert and Ike had worked on it for 4 months. My dad had never had the chance to use it. I would be the first. Testing it made me a little nervous, but Mr. Swigert was the most thorough person I'd ever met. I was sure he'd run a million computer simulations on it and checked and rechecked his design and assembly. We'll take it down to the lake to test, McGarrett said. No prying eyes. And a safe place to crash, I added. McGarrett and Mr. Swigert chuckled nervously at each other. Hitting the water at full speed would feel like concrete, Ike said factually. You'd break several bones and possibly die. The three of us stared at him with wide eyes, and Mr. Swigert squeezed his son's shoulder with a sigh. Mr. Swigert grabbed the J-Pack. Shall we? We piled into McGarrett's old World War II Army Jeep. The J-Pack sat between Ike and me as the Jeep bounced down the narrow dirt road leading to Cold Chase Lake. Private property and no trespassing signs ringed the lake, along with a series of remote sensors that warned McGarrett of unwanted visitors. 15 minutes later, and halfway through a McGarrett war story, the Jeep rolled onto the rocky shore of the lake, sending a flock of mallard ducks into the air. They flew a few dozen yards over the lake and landed on one of the many small islands. I slipped on a spare black coat that I had taken from the command center, and Mr. Swigert hefted the pack over my shoulders and secured it. He ran over the J-Pack's controls embedded on the backside of a pair of black gloves. Though it was my first time up, I didn't have the same anxiety about test flying the J-Pack as I did thinking about facing the HowlSage. Although I guess both could probably kill me. McGarrett handed me a black helmet with a chin strap and a pair of goggles that looked like they belonged to a World War I fighter pilot. I put on the glasses and information flashed across the lenses. Modern tech with a 1917 look. The lens tech was precisely like Mr. Swigert's. I slipped the helmet on last. "There's a mic in the chin strap and an earpiece in the right side of the helmet," McGarrett said. "We'll be in communication the whole time." "Ready?" Mr. Swigert asked as he stepped away. Ike touched the components on the jetpack while checking his tablet. "Okay, son, it's time." For a second, I thought my dad had checked in over the comms, but when I glanced up, I realized Dad was nowhere around here. It had only been Mr. Swigert talking to Ike. I scanned the edge of the lake. I would have given anything to have my dad there when I faced the HowlSage and took it down. Of course, I'd probably be assisting, not hunting, if Dad were still here. Ike backed away. "Taylor, take it up slow," McGarrett said. I nodded and pressed a green triangle on the backside of my left glove. The two wings expanded from the pack. The triangle turned red. If I touched it again, the wings would retract. Both gloves had the same controls, but I was right-handed, so I tended to rely on the controls on the back of the left glove. I pressed a green flame icon, and the J-Pack engines ignited in near silence. "We have ignition!" Ike shouted. I slid my finger up a green flashing line, and the thrust of the engines increased. My body lifted slowly at first. The liftoff was smooth and almost unnoticeable as I rose over McGarrett's head. "And launch!" Ike added. Mr. Swigert gave 2 thumbs up. My altitude and speed displayed on the goggle lenses. I increased the thrust, and soon I was higher than the nearest trees. I kicked my legs. Nothing, only air. So this is what birds see when they soar overhead. "More thrust before you try to fly forward," Mr. Swigert's voice squeaked through an earpiece in my helmet. At 50 miles per hour, I leaned forward. The shore shifted under me and disappeared as I zipped above the lake. I was about 300 feet in the air and nearing 80 miles per hour. This was freedom like I'd never felt it before. Millions of people flew every year in airplanes, but this was different. I was exposed, almost naked in the sky, with nothing holding me back or protecting me. The jealous grasp of gravity wanted to rip me back down to earth, but the jets fought on my behalf. "Once you're comfortable, make a wide turn," Mr. Swigert instructed. Flying was more relaxed than I had imagined. I turned in a full circle over the vast lake, then zipped past McGarrett, Mr. Swigert, and Ike. My confidence grew with the long turn and the ease of the controls and navigation. I turned again, and this time I twisted like a corkscrew. Kinley Peak, the sky, and Cold Chase Lake all became a swirling blur as I spun. I straightened and pulled my head up to gain altitude. Dizziness swooped through my head. I took a breath, and my heart pounded with a surge of adrenaline. I maxed out at 100 miles per hour and 500 feet altitude when McGarrett called me back down. I slowed and then straightened so that I was vertical. I dropped a bit too quickly and increased the thrusters to slow my descent. I hovered in midair for a moment, directly over everyone's heads, then continued decreasing thrust and lowered to the rocky shore. "Well done, Taylor." McGarrett hurried over and helped remove my gear. Mr. Swigert typed into a handheld device. "Yes, excellent. The J-Pack performed better than expected. You're a natural pilot." "What did you expect?" I asked. "The turning was the spot that posed the most serious danger, but you perfected that. Mr. Swigert was almost bouncing on his toes with excitement. Secondly, landing. But again, here you are. Well done. McGarrett slapped me on the shoulder. Well, let's head to the gym for some sparring. After dinner, I went to my room with no intention of going to sleep yet. I still felt like I was flying through the air, my mind buzzing with excitement. There was nothing like it. I flopped down onto the bed, let out a deep breath, and snatched an issue of my newest comic book, The Howling of Hamburg, flipping through the pages and half-heartedly reading. HowlSagen were notoriously tricky to mask from the public's knowledge. That was half our job, keeping the demon's physical presence hidden from the public. Humans, especially power-hungry ones, tended to see demons as a weapon for war or a path that led to power. Fortunately, HowlSagen were not a common occurrence. They rose once or twice a century at the most. The rarity was also a problem, though, because little was known about them. Even the society archives were sparse on information about the demons, and most of the stories or articles related to them were not written by society members, but instead by newspaper journalists, retelling someone's account of an encounter with a werewolf, or a colonial farmer's journal entry about a giant beast stealing livestock. The clock tower began to ring, 10 times. I needed to do one last thing before I went into battle tomorrow. I donned a black fleece jacket and athletic pants, and then tied up my sneakers. I slipped my sword into its sheath and strapped it to my waist. The window was in 2 sections filled with dozens of diamond-shaped panes. I pressed open the window at the center, and a cold breeze swept in, along with an eerie silence. The lights in the workshop were out, and the lawn was empty. I slipped out the window and down the 5-story trellis. Crouching, I crossed the front yard, past the fountain, then headed toward the workshop. I tapped in the passcode and entered. The lights went on automatically, and I spotted my target. The jetpack sat on the table, my flight gear right next to it. I grabbed the J-pack and gear and sneaked out the back door toward the woods. I planned to head to the lake, but I changed course for the basketball court. There were no branches overhead to get snagged on, and with near-silent engines, no one would hear me. Thermal imaging enhanced the night vision goggles, so my vision was nearly as good as during the day. A few minutes later, I was over the lake, cruising at 100 miles per hour and headed for the mines. The flight was smooth, and I landed inside a tall, chain-link fence meant to keep out trespassers. The mine entrance looked like a mouth waiting to swallow me. A large steel barrier was permanently bent backward from some teenager's truck, or maybe from the vehicle driven by whoever had attacked my dad. I walked toward the hole and slid my sword from its sheath to be safe. I wasn't there to fight, and I wasn't there to hunt. I was there to mourn for my dad one last time. Dad, I know you're not in these tunnels. I know you're with Jesus in heaven. I only wanted to see where you took your last few steps. It felt good to talk to my dad like he could hear me, even though he couldn't. I know you never expected me to wear your shoes so soon, but I am, and I'm going to make you proud. I'm going to banish the HowlSage, find the person that lured you into the tunnels, and then kill every swamp Sagen I find. The chain-link fence rattled behind me, and I spun around. My night vision flared in a flashlight's beam. Taylor, I knew you'd come. I stared at my feet. McGarrett pushed open the fence, the rusted lock long broken. I know why you came. I even expected it. I'm here for the same reason. I lowered my sword. McGarrett stepped past me. We stared at the tunnel entrance. Your dad was a brave man and an excellent hunter. Silence. Tears welled in my eyes. I tried holding them back. I'm going to destroy it. I know. McGarrett put a hand on my shoulder. I know. And then the tears broke free.